The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean in early 1943 presented a dire reality for American carrier pilots as they ascended into their cockpits, acutely aware of the grim statistics. The attrition rate was alarmingly brutal. For every Japanese aircraft successfully downed, the United States suffered the loss of nearly one of its own. In certain aerial confrontations, this ratio skewed even more unfavorably. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which had served as the stalwart backbone of naval carrier aviation since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, found itself catastrophically outmatched in vertical engagements. Pilots, gripped by a palpable sense of foreboding, routinely penned letters home before missions, understanding full well the perilous fate that often awaited them at higher altitudes. The Mitsubishi A6M0 possessed an unparalleled ability to outclimb any aircraft the Navy could deploy. Consequently, when Japanese pilots identified American formations, their strategy was not to engage horizontally but to ascend rapidly. Once positioned above a Wildcat in a zero, the American pilot's fate was, in essence, sealed. The prevailing issue was not a deficit of courage. American naval aviators possessed an abundance of that quality. Instead, the fundamental challenge lay in the immutable laws of physics. The Zero, with an empty weight of 5,300 pounds, was significantly lighter than the Wildcat, which tipped the scales at 5,800 pounds, while being powered by less potent engines. In a direct climbing contest, the Zero could ascend at an impressive 3,100 feet per minute, within its optimal performance envelope. Conversely, the Wildcat struggled to exceed 2,300 feet per minute. This critical 800-foot per minute differential rapidly transformed into a lethal disadvantage within merely 90 seconds of the initial contact. Japanese pilots consistently exploited this inherent superiority. Upon sighting an American formation at 12,000 feet, they would immediately initiate a steep climb in their Zeros, positioning themselves at a commanding 15,000 or 16,000 feet before American pilots could effectively react. They would then execute devastating diving attacks, often with the sun at their backs, tearing through the formations with their potent 20mm cannons before the Wildcats could even maneuver to meet the threat. By the time American pilots attempted to climb in retaliation, the Zeros had already regained their altitude, typically 3,000 feet above, their energy restored and ready to initiate another pass. Pilots consistently recounted the same harrowing experiences over Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and indeed every contested stretch of water between Hawaii and the Philippines. The moment the telltale glint of enemy aircraft appeared, American aviators would push their throttles to the maximum. Their Wildcats would valiantly claw for altitude, yet the altimeter needle would ascend with agonizing slowness, as if navigating through thick treacle. Meanwhile, the Zeros would seemingly vanish, not in retreat, but by swiftly climbing into a position of overwhelming dominance. A number of American pilots, driven by desperation, attempted to follow them upward. The vast majority of these courageous individuals never returned. The few who survived described a chilling scenario, their airspeed bleeding away precipitously as they pitched upward, the flight controls becoming unresponsive and mushy, the airframe shuddering with the unmistakable warning of an impending stall. All while streams of tracer fire began to arc upward from below, signaling that another Zero had maneuvered into a deadly position beneath their tail during their frantic climb attempt. It became unequivocally clear victory in the vertical dimension was unattainable. The Zero utterly owned the vertical space. Please Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch in 1942 devised a partial solution to this aerial conundrum with his innovative weave maneuver. This tactic involved pairs of fighter aircraft rhythmically scissoring back and forth, effectively covering each other's vulnerable tails. While this defensive strategy undoubtedly saved lives and afforded Wildcat pilots a fighting chance in horizontal engagements, the Thatch weave was fundamentally a defensive doctrine, a survival tactic. It did not, however, address the critical altitude problem. It failed to prevent Japanese pilots from exploiting their climbing superiority to gain the sun and set up devastating ambushes. One could execute the weave with perfect precision at 10,000 feet, but if 6 Zeros were positioned at 18,000 feet with the sun directly behind them, the outcome for the American pilots would still be exceptionally grim. The weave might enable survival through the initial pass, perhaps even a second, but with every defensive turn, precious energy was expended. The Zeros, meanwhile, would simply climb back to altitude and reset, possessing both the time and the vertical advantage to dictate the flow of combat. Squadron commanders, in their after-action reports, painted a consistently grim picture, their narratives often reading like veritable horror stories. Recurring phrases such as, "Engaged 12 enemy fighters at air weight 47 hours. Lost 5 aircraft. Enemy casualties, 2 probable, 1 confirmed. Enemy fighters climbed away and refused further engagement on our terms," highlighted the core issue. That specific phrase, "refused further engagement on our terms," appeared with disturbing frequency. The Japanese were not retreating. They were strategically climbing and repositioning themselves. They were leveraging the singular advantage that American fighters could not counter in 1943. And doing so, they were decimating trained pilots at a rate faster than Pensacola could possibly replace them. The Thatch weave was adopted as standard doctrine across every carrier air group by mid-1942, and within its specific limitations, it proved genuinely effective. When 2 Wildcats executed the weave flawlessly, they established a mutual defense pattern that proved exceedingly difficult for a Zero to penetrate without exposing itself to return fire. However, the fundamental problem became apparent upon closer examination of what the weave actually achieved. It kept pilots alive, but it did not enable them to decisively win engagements. Fleet Air Arm analysts at Pearl Harbor diligently compiled engagement reports throughout the entirety of 1942, and the emerging pattern was unmistakably clear. American pilots who employed the Thatch weave survived aerial encounters at significantly higher rates than those who did not. Yet survival and outright victory represented distinct outcomes. The weave, by its very design, traded offensive killing power for enhanced staying power. A typical engagement over the Solomon Islands in late 1942 vividly illustrates this dynamic. 4 Wildcats, operating in 2 weaving pairs, encountered 6 Zeros at 14,000 feet. The American pilots executed their scissors pattern with exemplary precision. The Zeros initiated their initial diving pass, but the weave compelled them to break off without achieving any kills, as each time a Zero committed to attacking 1 Wildcat, that pilot's wingman would maneuver into an advantageous firing position. It was a display of superb defensive flying. The Zeros subsequently climbed away, and the Wildcats attempted to pursue. It was precisely at this juncture that the immutable problem of physics reasserted itself with a vengeance. To sustain the integrity of the weave, both aircraft were compelled to meticulously coordinate their turns. Each turn, however, inevitably dissipated energy. Every cycle of the weave exacted a toll of approximately 40 knots of airspeed and 800 feet of altitude. Pilots were deliberately sacrificing their climb performance to maintain the critical mutual support. Simultaneously, the Zeros, now operating independently, channeled all their energy into a rapid, vertical ascent. Within 3 minutes, they would invariably be back at a commanding 18,000 feet. The Wildcats, in stark contrast, were struggling to reach 13,000 feet and were now flying 90 knots slower than when the engagement had initially commenced. Commander Thatch himself acknowledged this inherent limitation in a February 1943 briefing delivered to carrier squadron leaders. His precise words, meticulously recorded in the training minutes, were, "The weave gives our boys the defensive edge they need to survive the first encounter. It does not give them the offensive capability to pursue and destroy a climbing enemy." He was not criticizing his own tactical innovation, but rather clearly delineating its operational boundaries. The weave represented a groundbreaking advancement in defensive fighter doctrine, but it was inherently reactive. Pilots were merely responding to Japanese attacks, not dictating the terms of combat. The Zero pilots retained the initiative, deciding when to engage and when to disengage, because they could always climb away faster than American aircraft could follow, while simultaneously maintaining their defensive formation. A number of aggressive pilots, in moments of desperation, attempted to abandon the weave in a bid to chase the climbing Zeros. The resulting loss rates for these ill-fated attempts were nothing short of catastrophic. Breaking from one's wingman, applying full throttle, and pitching up to pursue a climbing Zero would, for perhaps 45 seconds, create the illusion of gaining ground. The gun sight might even track the enemy aircraft. Then, inevitably, airspeed would plummet below 180 knots. The controls would become heavy and unresponsive. The rate of climb would deteriorate from merely inadequate to utterly pathetic. The Zero being chased, meanwhile, would continue to accelerate upward at an even steeper angle. Worse still, by separating from one's wingman, the crucial mutual support was lost. Other Zeros in the vicinity would immediately identify a lone Wildcat engaged in a slow climb, a state of maximum vulnerability. They would swiftly position themselves above and behind the isolated aircraft, and the first indication of their presence would often be 7.7 millimeter rounds tearing through the armor plate. If fortunate, the pilot would recognize the imminent danger quickly enough to push the nose down and execute a desperate dive away. If not, squadron mates would bear witness to their aircraft trailing smoke and fire as it arced catastrophically into the ocean. The mathematical reality was unforgiving. In a meticulously coordinated weave, Wildcat pairs achieved approximately 1.3 kills for every loss incurred against Zeros. This was survivable, albeit barely sustainable in the long term. Individual Wildcats attempting to pursue climbing Zeros, however, achieved a dismal 0.4 kills per loss, an utterly catastrophic ratio. The doctrine effectively wrote itself, "Stay in the weave, except that you can't chase them into altitude. Focus on protecting the bombers and surviving to land back on the carrier." This represented sound tactical thinking, given the inherent equipment constraints, but it left American fighter pilots with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. They were flying defensively in what was fundamentally an offensive war. Every engagement concluded in the same disheartening manner. American pilots survived, the Zeros climbed away, and the following day they would return, once again possessing the critical altitude advantage. It was impossible to win a war of attrition when the enemy consistently dictated both the initiation and conclusion of every engagement. The arrival of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Pacific Carrier squadrons during May 1943 was met with an initial surge of enthusiastic, though cautiously optimistic, reactions from pilots. This new aircraft was an absolute behemoth compared to the Wildcat. Its formidable Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine generated an astounding 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of the Wildcat's power plant. While the Hellcat was undeniably heavier, with an empty weight of 9,060 pounds, that colossal engine more than compensated with authoritative power. Its maximum speed soared to 380 minutes, and its rate of climb dramatically improved to an impressive 3,500 feet per minute under optimal conditions. On paper, the Hellcat either matched or surpassed the Zero in virtually every critical performance category. Pilots climbing into the Hellcat's cockpit for the very first time immediately sensed the profound difference. The acceleration was violent, almost exhilarating. The rate of climb was intoxicating, instilling a newfound confidence. Finally, an American carrier fighter had arrived that did not instantly feel like a significant disadvantage the moment enemy aircraft were spotted. The USS Essex initiated the inaugural combat deployment of the Hellcat on August 31st, 1943, during aerial offensives directed against Marcus Island. The immediate outcomes proved highly encouraging, signifying a promising beginning for the new fighter. 2 Zero aircraft were successfully eliminated without any losses to the Hellcat contingent. Yet this particular engagement did not involve complex, high-altitude maneuvering. Instead, the aerial combat transpired between altitudes of 8,000 and 12,000 feet, characterized predominantly by horizontal scissors maneuvers and deflection shooting techniques. In these specific conditions, the Hellcat's superior velocity and formidable armament truly distinguished themselves. Its array of 650 caliber machine guns unleashed an overwhelmingly destructive volume of fire, while the robust airframe demonstrated an exceptional capacity to withstand damage that would have utterly disintegrated a more fragile Zero. Upon their return to the Essex, pilots articulated a newfound and profound sense of confidence, declaring for the first time in the conflict that this formidable aircraft possessed the capability to contend with Zero fighters on genuinely equal terms. Squadron commanders, buoyed by these initial successes, submitted highly optimistic action reports, unequivocally proclaiming the Hellcat to be the decisive answer for which everyone had been so eagerly anticipating throughout the arduous war effort. However, the subsequent transition to high-altitude engagements quickly brought the aircraft, as inherent limitations, into sharp relief. During operations over Rabaul in October 1943, Hellcat pilots encountered seasoned Zero aviators who instinctively reverted to their time-tested and highly effective combat doctrine: they would climb. The Hellcats, equipped with their improved capabilities, were indeed able to pursue and maintain closer proximity to the ascending Zeros than the older Wildcats ever could. The advertised 3,500 feet per minute climb rate was undeniably genuine. Nevertheless, veteran Zero pilots, masters of energy management, consistently achieved higher altitudes more rapidly. A Zero expertly flown, could sustain a climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute while simultaneously preserving its critical maneuverability. Conversely, the Hellcat attained its maximum climb performance only within a meticulously specific operational envelope, requiring precise throttle settings, exact pitch angles, and particular airspeeds. Any deviation from this narrow configuration resulted in a swift and significant degradation of its climbing prowess. More critically, the Hellcat's 400-pound weight advantage over the Zero, a benefit in other aspects of flight, transformed into a distinct disadvantage during prolonged vertical maneuvering. While an initial climb could be matched, sustaining that ascent while simultaneously attempting to maneuver for a firing solution consumed the Hellcat energy reserves at a significantly faster rate than the lighter Zero. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, a pilot from VF-9 Squadron, succinctly articulated this critical dilemma in his November 1943 debriefing. The Hellcat will climb with a Zero if you fly it perfectly, and the Zero pilot makes mistakes. Against experienced Japanese pilots who know their aircraft, you're still watching them gain altitude advantage. It's smaller than the gap we faced in Wildcats, but it's real. Once they're above 20,000 FT with the sun behind them, we're back to playing defense. Valencia, recognized as one of the Navy's most astute tactical minds, precisely identified the fundamental issue. The Hellcat had undeniably narrowed the performance disparity. Yet it had not entirely eradicated the core problem of the Zero's persistent vertical energy advantage. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Through the latter part of 1943, pilots diligently experimented with a variety of tactical approaches. Some attempted aggressive climbing pursuits the instant enemy Zeros were sighted, harboring the hope that the Hellcat's sheer power would simply overpower the altitude differential. The results of these experiments were decidedly mixed. Against Japanese pilots of average skill, this tactic proved reasonably effective. However, when pitted against seasoned veterans, it invariably remained a perilous trap. Committing to a vertical chase meant rapidly expending precious fuel and energy in the climb, while the experienced Zero pilot would deftly angle his ascent to maintain separation. A mere 20 seconds later, both aircraft might find themselves at 18,000 feet, but the Zero would be maintaining a critical 2,000-foot altitude advantage, positioning itself for a devastating diving pass, while the Hellcat was left slow and perilously vulnerable. Other pilots attempted a modified version of the thatch weave in their Hellcats, finding it more effective than in the slower Wildcats due to the Hellcat's superior speed. But this approach still necessitated flying defensively. It still allowed the Japanese to dictate the crucial vertical dimensions of the engagement. The Hellcat was, without question, a significant improvement. Kill ratios in horizontal engagements shifted dramatically in favor of American forces, reaching nearly 4:1 in the concluding months of 1943. Yet the persistent altitude problem endured. Japanese pilots who possessed a profound understanding of vertical energy fighting could still compel Hellcats into profoundly disadvantageous positions. The true solution, it became clear, lay not in the aircraft's inherent performance specifications, which were already optimized, but rather in the innovative application of the Hellcat's formidable capabilities by its pilots. In late 1943, however, no one had yet definitively deciphered this elusive tactical riddle. In February 1944, Commander David McCampbell assumed command of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex, bringing with him a singular obsession with altitude doctrine that his pilots initially perceived as excessive. McCampbell held no interest in merely achieving incremental improvements to existing, often flawed, tactics. He had meticulously analyzed every engagement report spanning the preceding 18 months, discerning a critical pattern that most other commanders had overlooked. American pilots consistently fought for altitude parity with Japanese aircraft. Their standard procedure involved climbing to match the enemy's altitude, then attempting to initiate an engagement. McCampbell contended that this approach was fundamentally misconceived. His philosophy dictated that one should not fight to attain the enemy's altitude. Rather, one should fight from an altitude that the enemy could not effectively contest. The true advantage, he argued, was not merely being at the same height, but unequivocally dominating the vertical space where the sun could be strategically utilized to render one's aircraft virtually invisible. Consequently, his pilots commenced a radically different training regimen in March 1944. Standard carrier air patrol doctrine typically positioned fighter aircraft at altitudes ranging from 12,000 to 15,000 feet, a height considered sufficient for a reasonable warning time while simultaneously conserving precious fuel. McCampbell, however, demanded that his fighters orbit at a minimum of 20,000 feet and, whenever operationally feasible, at 25,000 feet. More critically, he insisted that they precisely position themselves between the sun and the anticipated axis of the enemy threat. This meant not merely flying generally towards the sun, but aligning themselves directly in line such that any enemy aircraft looking upward would be forced to stare directly into the blinding solar glare. His squadron leaders initially voiced strong objections, citing that, operating at 25,000 feet, consumed fuel at a significantly faster rate, that the extreme cold was intensely uncomfortable, and that the pilots would suffer. However, McCampbell remained wholly unconcerned with comfort. His focus was solely on the immutable principles of physics and human biology. At 25,000 feet, with the sun positioned at a 45-degree angle directly behind an aircraft, that aircraft became effectively invisible to any pilot below attempting to visually locate it. Their eyes simply could not distinguish the aircraft, silhouette against the overwhelming brilliance of the solar disk. By the time they even began to register a presence, the Hellcat would already be plummeting through 20,000 feet, armed with a devastating 450 mpq of accumulated kinetic energy. The first resounding application of this revolutionary strategy occurred on March 30, 1944, during the course of strikes against Palau. Air Group 15 launched a fighter sweep with exceptionally precise instructions, climbed to 24,000 feet, position with the sun at the 7 o'clock high position, and patiently await Japanese interceptors to climb directly into this pre-established kill zone. 18 Hellcats meticulously orbited at this elevated altitude for 23 minutes. Japanese radar systems soon detected the American strike package, prompting the launch of 16 Zeros from Peleliu Airfield. The Zeros ascended aggressively to intercept, precisely as McCampbell had anticipated. They reached 18,000 feet and continued their climb, diligently searching for the American fighters that radar had indicated were present in the area. The Zero pilots meticulously scanned the sky, checking their 6 o'clock position and diligently clearing the airspace above them. They were executing every maneuver correctly, according to their ingrained training. Yet, they remained utterly oblivious to the Hellcats' presence until the very first diving pass tore violently through their formation. McCampbell personally spearheaded the devastating attack. His division plunged from 24,000 feet at a nearly vertical angle, rapidly accelerating to a blistering 420 km/h. The Hellcats streaked through the zero formation with the destructive velocity of meteors. McCampbell's initial burst of fire obliterated the wing route of a Zero at 19,000 feet. The Japanese pilot never evinced any reaction, never attempted to maneuver, for the simple reason that he had never visually perceived the imminent threat. The E-FIR entire engagement concluded in a mere 90 seconds. 7 Zeros were utterly destroyed, with an additional 3 sustaining damage and fleeing the scene. Crucially, there were 0 American losses. The remaining Japanese fighters scattered in disarray, diving for deck level, and abandoning any further attempts to climb back into the fight. They found themselves utterly incapable of ascending towards an enemy they could not even discern. McCampbell's after-action report was starkly clinical in its assessment. Enemy aircraft demonstrated no awareness of our presence until weapon impact. Solar positioning provided complete tactical surprise despite clear weather conditions. Other squadron commanders initially greeted McCampbell's report with considerable skepticism. 7 kills in 90 seconds seemed to border on hyperbole. However, the irrefutable gun camera footage from the Hellcats proved unambiguous. Frame after frame depicted Zero pilots maintaining steady, unwavering flight paths right up until the precise moment that 50 caliber rounds began impacting their aircraft. There were no defensive breaks, no evasive maneuvers, absolutely nothing. They were, quite literally, flying blind, because their established visual search pattern mandated that they look upward into the sun quadrant to locate any potential threats. And human eyes are simply incapable of performing that task effectively above 15,000 feet. The delicate photoreceptors in the human retina are completely overwhelmed by the intense solar radiation at that specific altitude and angle. While the brain may receive signals, it is utterly unable to process distinct shapes or discernible movement against the overwhelming glare. The Zeros were desperately attempting to locate the Hellcats. Their eyes were, however, physically incapable of accomplishing that critical task. Within a single week, word of this groundbreaking tactic permeated throughout the entire carrier task force. McCampbell's strategy was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a proven, devastatingly effective reality. The core tenets were clear: command the altitude, dominate the sun's position, and patiently await the enemy to climb directly into your trap. The Japanese were utterly unable to devise a counter to this tactic, because any effective countermeasure would necessitate visual contact with an enemy that their eyes simply could not detect. Consequently, the Zero's renowned climb rate advantage became entirely irrelevant. They could ascend as rapidly as they desired, but they were merely climbing into a lethal killing zone they were physically incapable of seeing. The human eye, despite being an exquisitely remarkable instrument, operates within absolute and unyielding physical limitations that cannot be overcome through mere training or sheer willpower. At sea level, on a clear day, human eyes typically adapt to approximately 10,000 lux of ambient light. Under such conditions, pupils constrict, photoreceptor cells meticulously regulate their sensitivity, and the brain can distinguish shapes, movement, and intricate detail with extraordinary precision. However, direct sunlight delivers an astonishing 120,000 lux of illumination even at ground level. When one gazes directly at the sun, even for a fleeting fraction of a second, the retinal cells are immediately and overwhelmingly saturated. The rhodopsin pigment within the rod cells rapidly bleaches out, while the cone cells, which are responsible for discerning detail and color, effectively shut down as a protective measure against potential damage. The brain interprets this deluge of light as an intense, white-hot glare, utterly devoid of any detailed resolution. This physiological response is precisely why humans cannot stare directly at the sun. Our own inherent biology intervenes to safeguard our vision. Protecting one's visual acuity becomes significantly more challenging when operating at elevated altitudes. As atmospheric density diminishes with increasing height, the natural filtering of solar radiation also decreases. At an elevation of 20,000 feet, for instance, the intensity of solar radiation escalates by approximately 30% compared to sea level conditions due to the reduced atmospheric absorption and scattering of light. Consequently, an initial measurement of 120,000 lux at ground level transforms into a staggering 156,000 lux. This amplified light intensity results in a more severe glare, causing pupils to constrict even further and eyes to water profusely. Crucially for military aviators, this extreme environment leads to a catastrophic collapse in contrast sensitivity, which is the eye's fundamental capacity to differentiate an object from its background. Under typical ground-level conditions, the human eye can discern contrast variations as subtle as 2%. However, at high altitudes, particularly when looking anywhere near the sun, this sensitivity plummets to 15% or even worse. This dramatic reduction renders a Zero aircraft, with its dark blue-gray camouflage, virtually undetectable against the bright sky if it is positioned within a 40-degree conical region surrounding the solar disk. Japanese pilots in 1944 were acutely aware of the necessity to scan for aerial threats positioned above them. They were rigorously trained to regularly check their 6 o'clock high position, yet their training protocols failed to account for the inherent physiological impossibility of conducting an effective visual search within the sun's quadrant at such altitudes. Thus, when a Zero pilot at 16,000 feet attempted to scan the sky above, and the sun was situated at his 11 o'clock high, his eyes were physically incapable of processing any meaningful visual information in that specific area, perceiving only a blinding white glare. The pilot might fleetingly glimpse darker patches within this intense glare, but he would be utterly unable to determine whether these fleeting visuals represented actual clouds, mere optical artifacts resulting from his strained retinas, or more critically, 4 Hellcat fighters strategically positioning themselves for a devastating dive attack. His brain, under these circumstances, was receiving severely corrupted visual data. While he might harbor a vague suspicion that something was present, this mere intuition did not furnish him with the vital target information required for effective engagement, precise range, exact bearing, current altitude, or the total number of approaching aircraft. Conversely, the Hellcat pilots, who skillfully exploited this tactical advantage, were also subject to the same biological limitations, but they had ingeniously positioned themselves such that these constraints worked in their favor rather than against them. When operating at 24,000 feet with the adversary positioned below at 17,000 feet, the attacking pilots were looking downward. With the sun strategically placed behind and above them, they were not compelled to stare directly into debilitating glare. Instead, the enemy aircraft below were starkly silhouetted against the darker expanse of the ocean or the island terrain, allowing their contrast sensitivity to remain entirely normal. This optimal positioning enabled them to accurately count the enemy aircraft, meticulously assess their formations, deliberately select their targets, and initiate their assault with precision, all while the unsuspecting enemy was still blindly searching upward into the glare, desperately trying to locate them. In essence, the Hellcat pilots possessed complete and actionable information, whereas their adversaries had none. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. This profound information asymmetry proved to be more strategically invaluable than superior speed, a faster climb rate, or any other performance specification detailed in the Hellcat's technical manual. Subsequent combat ophthalmology studies, meticulously conducted after the war, precisely quantified the magnitude of this effect. Test subjects tasked with identifying aircraft silhouettes positioned within a 30-degree arc of the sun at simulated altitudes exhibited an identification accuracy rate of less than 8%. However, when the aircraft's position was shifted to 45 degrees away from the sun, accuracy dramatically improved to 43%. Further increasing the angular separation to 60 degrees or more from the sun resulted in an impressive accuracy rate of 89%. This stark difference underscores that the boundary between survival and demise in an aerial dogfight was quite literally determined by mere angular degrees of separation from the blinding solar disk. American pilots in early 1944 began to uncover this crucial insight through direct combat experience. They quickly realized that correct positioning relative to the sun rendered them virtually invisible, akin to a ghost, while incorrect positioning immediately transformed them into an exposed target. From the Japanese perspective, there was no effective countermeasure to this devastating tactic. It was physiologically impossible to train human eyes to penetrate solar glare at high altitudes, and no tactical development could overcome such a fundamental biological limitation. Some highly experienced Japanese pilots attempted alternative strategies, such as maintaining defensive weaves during their ascent, assigning wingmen to scan different sectors of the sky, or intentionally limiting their maximum altitude to remain below the perceived killing zone. Regrettably, none of these improvised approaches yielded consistent success. A wingman assigned to scan a different section of the sky would also avoid the sun quadrant, subject to the same physiological constraints. Defensive weaving during a climb significantly bled energy and hampered their ascent rate. Moreover, deliberately limiting altitude meant entirely conceding the invaluable vertical advantage to the enemy. The Americans had stumbled upon a tactic that ruthlessly exploited an uncounterable human weakness. Every Japanese pilot shared the same ocular limitations, and the sun's formidable intensity shone indiscriminately upon every aircraft operating in the Pacific theater. On June 19, 1944, the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea lay deceptively tranquil and blue beneath the tropical sun. Yet, American radar screens presented a starkly different, urgent reality. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's formidable Task Force 58 had patiently awaited this pivotal moment throughout the morning. Waves of Japanese land-based aircraft originating from Guam, Rota, and Tinian were already in the air, representing the largest coordinated aerial strike the Imperial Japanese Navy had dared to attempt since the Battle of Midway. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had committed every available resource, recognizing that the ongoing American invasion of Saipan posed a direct threat to Japan's inner defensive perimeter. His failure to halt the invasion fleet would irrevocably usher the war into its decisive, final phase. Japanese commanders, banking on the superior range of their aircraft and the element of overwhelming mass surprise, launched an immense force of 373 aircraft in multiple waves. Their strategic calculus anticipated that sheer numerical superiority would overwhelm American defenses. What they crucially failed to comprehend was that Task Force 58 had meticulously positioned 450 Hellcat fighters in carefully layered defensive stations, and every single squadron commander had fully embraced McCampbell's innovative altitude sun doctrine. The Combat Air Patrol, CAP, was not uniformly distributed at a single medium altitude. Instead, it was vertically stacked with deliberate, tactical precision. Lower CAP stations maintained orbits at 10,000 feet, tasked with intercepting any enemy aircraft that managed to penetrate the initial defenses. Middle stations were positioned at 18,000 feet. The critical killer stations, manned by the most seasoned and expert pilots, orbited at a commanding altitude of 23,000 to 25,000 feet, strategically placed directly between the sun and the anticipated axis of the incoming threat. Fighter directors aboard the aircraft carriers had precisely calculated the sun's position for 10,036 hours, the moment the first Japanese wave was expected. These high cap stations were then vectored to exact coordinates, ensuring they were situated within the solar glare from the perspective of any approaching enemy aircraft. The initial Japanese wave materialized on radar screens at precisely 10,036 hours, 140 miles west of the task force, a formidable formation of 71 aircraft, comprising Zeros, Judies, and Gills, steadily climbing to their attack altitude as they closed the distance. The fighter director's voice crackled with urgency through every Hellcat's radio. Vector 270, bogies inbound, Angels 18, and climbing. The lower and middle cap stations immediately swung into action to intercept. The high stations, however, remained stationary, patiently waiting for their opportune moment. The Japanese formation continued its ascent, passing through 16,000 feet, then 18,000 feet, still relentlessly approaching. They maintained their attack formation, their primary focus on preserving their relative positions and scanning ahead for the American fleet. They anticipated encountering American fighters and were mentally prepared for a horizontal engagement. What they were utterly unprepared for was the entirely silent and sudden descent of 48 Hellcats, diving with lethal intent directly out of the sun from a commanding altitude of 25,000 feet. Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15 Strike Division, spearheaded this devastating bounce attack. His aircraft rapidly accelerated past 400 minnometers during the dive. The Japanese formation, positioned 4,000 feet below him, was perfectly silhouetted against the dark expanse of the ocean. He could clearly discern individual aircraft types, readily identify the bombers clustered in the center of the formation, and calmly select his target with unhurried precision. The Japanese pilots perceived absolutely nothing until Brewer's initial burst of gunfire detonated the fuel tank of a Judy bomber at 19,000 feet. At that instant, the entire formation disintegrated into utter chaos. Hellcats seemed to appear from every direction, suddenly firing from multiple angles, slashing through the Japanese formation with a speed that rendered any counterattack impossible. The Japanese pilots desperately attempted to react, but their Responses were sluggish and confused, primarily because they had never witnessed the development of the threat. Some attempted to dive away, only to find the lower cap stations strategically waiting below them. Others tried to climb back to achieve an altitude advantage, but the middle cap stations were perfectly positioned to intercept any ascending aircraft. There was simply nowhere safe to retreat. The formation that had commenced with 71 aircraft suffered the loss of 42 within the first 8 minutes of combat. The second wave, launched from Guam at 11 to 30 hours, consisted of 130 aircraft. Again, fighter directors expertly vectored the high cap stations into their optimal positions at 24,000 feet, with the sun behind them, patiently awaiting the enemy. The devastating pattern repeated itself. The Japanese climbed to their attack altitude. The Hellcats plunged from the solar glare. This encounter resulted in the destruction of 97 more Japanese aircraft. The third wave, arriving at 13,000 hours, comprised 47 aircraft, of which 31 were obliterated. The fourth wave, at 1430 hours, involved 82 aircraft attempting a coordinated strike from multiple directions, leading to the destruction of 63. By 16 hours, the engagement, which would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was effectively concluded. Japanese commanders ceased launching further strikes, having exhausted their remaining aircraft and pilots. The final grim tally revealed 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses, in stark contrast, amounted to only 29 Hellcats. The resulting kill ratio stood at an astonishing 12:1. Yet even this impressive figure failed to fully capture the overwhelming totality of the tactical victory. The majority of those 29 American losses occurred during low-altitude engagements or were attributable to operational accidents rather than Japanese pilots achieving genuine air superiority. In the high-altitude bounces, the engagements where Hellcats meticulously employed their sun-altitude positioning doctrine, the kill ratio approached an almost unbelievable 30:1. Post-battle interviews with the few surviving Japanese pilots unveiled a profound sense of demoralization. Multiple pilots recounted the exact same harrowing experience, climbing to intercept, diligently scanning for threats, seeing absolutely nothing. Then, in a terrifying instant, their wingman would suddenly be engulfed in flames and plummeting, and they still had no idea where the attack had originated. A profound sense of disorientation pervaded the adversary ranks, for they often remained utterly unaware of the origin point of the devastating aerial assaults. One particularly poignant testimony from a captured pilot, meticulously translated from his post-engagement debriefing, articulated this profound bewilderment. We were utterly unable to locate them. Our gaze swept across every conceivable vector. Then, without warning, their ordnance was upon us. How does one contend with an enemy that remains perpetually unseen? This sentiment encapsulated the perplexing new reality of aerial combat. The pivotal engagement known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot transcended the mere definition of a tactical triumph. It heralded nothing less than a revolutionary shift in military doctrine. Astonishingly, this doctrinal transformation was disseminated with a speed uncharacteristic of conventional military bureaucracy. Within a mere 72 hours following the intense aerial confrontation, the dedicated staff of Vice Admiral Mitcher meticulously crafted a preliminary tactical bulletin. This critical document was then swiftly distributed to every single carrier air group operating within the vast expanse of the Pacific Fleet, signaling an immediate and widespread adoption of new combat principles. The fundamental directive encapsulated within this bulletin was strikingly straightforward and unyielding. The strategic utilization of altitude and sun positioning was to be integrated as an indispensable mandatory tenet for all future fighter operations. It was not presented as a mere suggestion, nor an experimental concept to be explored at leisure, but rather as an absolute imperative. To ensure comprehensive implementation, the bulletin delineated precise operational protocols. These included maintaining minimum patrol altitudes of 20,000 feet, contingent upon fuel reserves, exacting calculations to ensure the sun remained within a 30-degree arc directly behind the Combat Air Patrol DOC-AP station, and the establishment of standardized communication procedures designed to flawlessly coordinate high-altitude diving attacks or bounces. Every squadron commander received unequivocal orders to enact these procedures without delay. We trust you are finding this historical account as compelling as we do. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video to uncover the full extent of this tactical revolution. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Furthermore, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you are from and what you think about this pivotal topic in military aviation history. Initially, a degree of resistance emerged from certain commanding officers, particularly those whose squadrons had not been direct participants in the decisive Philippine Sea engagement. Their objections largely conformed to predictable patterns centered on perceived operational drawbacks. For instance, operating at an elevated altitude of 25,000 feet was cited as reducing patrol endurance by a significant 20%, primarily due to the increased rate of fuel consumption at such heights. Pilots also conveyed experiences of heightened fatigue and discomfort from the extreme cold during extended patrols at these rarefied altitudes. Moreover, the potential for oxygen system malfunctions became a far more critical concern when aircraft were routinely operating at their ceiling altitudes, posing a direct threat to pilot safety. These concerns, though rooted in the realities of high-altitude flight, were met not with dismissive disregard, but with a rigorous, data-driven response from Mitcher's astute staff. While acknowledging the legitimate increase in fuel consumption, they presented irrefutable evidence that mission effectiveness simultaneously surged by an astonishing factor of 6. Similarly, the discomfort experienced by pilots was conceded, yet this was juxtaposed against an 85% improvement in pilot survival rates. Regarding the critical nature of oxygen systems, the solution proposed was not to abandon the altitude advantage, but to institute more stringent pre-flight checks and mandate the carriage of redundant backup systems. The mathematical evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. Every objection, when scrutinized, ultimately revolved around an inconvenience. The newly established doctrine conversely promised and delivered an unparalleled level of lethality and strategic superiority. By the advent of August 1944, a sweeping transformation had occurred across the Pacific theater. Every fleet carrier and light carrier had fundamentally reconfigured its fighter operations to align with the altitude sun doctrine. This pervasive shift necessitated a radical overhaul of training protocols. New pilots arriving at replacement squadrons stationed in Pearl Harbor no longer dedicated the majority of their advanced training to intricate dogfighting maneuvers. Instead, their curriculum was now predominantly focused on mastering altitude energy management, precise sun angle calculations, and the execution of devastatingly effective high-speed diving attacks. This revised curriculum was a direct reflection of the brutal realities of the contemporary battlefield. The need to outmaneuver an agile Japanese Zero in a protracted turning fight became largely obsolete if one could neutralize the enemy aircraft before its pilot even registered a threat. Consequently, the paramount skills now valued were unwavering climb discipline, maintaining impeccable formation integrity at extreme altitudes, accurate target identification from a superior vantage point of 4,000 feet above the enemy, and unerring gunnery accuracy during high-speed dives. All other combat proficiencies, while not entirely discarded, were relegated to a secondary status. Lieutenant Alex Vasu of VF-16 rapidly distinguished himself as one of the doctrine's most exemplary and effective practitioners. During the climactic Second Battle of the Philippine Sea on October 24, 1944, his division flawlessly intercepted a Japanese strike group, executing a textbook application of altitude sun positioning. Vasu's official report meticulously detailed the engagement with remarkable technical precision, painting a vivid picture of the encounter. Establish cap at 24,000 FT with sun bearing 280-degree relative. Bogies appeared at Angel 17, bearing 315 degrees, range 22 miles. Executed diving attack from 25,000 FT, achieving 430 knots, indicated airspeed. First burst at 19,500 FT destroyed lead bomber. Second burst at 18,800 FT destroyed second bomber. Pulled out at $16,000 FI. Climbed back to $23,000 foe. Repositioned with sun behind me, repeated attack sequence. This clinical description underscored the systematic and devastating efficacy of the new tactics. Demonstrating extraordinary prowess, Vasu decimated 6 enemy aircraft within an astonishing 8 minutes, employing multiple successive bounces from his unassailable altitude advantage. The Japanese forces proved utterly incapable of mounting any effective defense whatsoever, primarily because their pilots never achieved visual contact with the attackers before the swift and lethal assaults had fully materialized. The profound effectiveness of this doctrine ensured its rapid dissemination beyond the confines of carrier operations. Marine Corps fighter squadrons, operating from newly secured island bases, swiftly adopted these identical, highly successful tactics. Major Robert Gaylor, commanding VMF 224 on Majuro Atoll, consistently positioned his formidable Corsairs at a commanding altitude of 22,000 feet during defensive patrols. When Japanese bombers approached the island at a comparatively lower altitude of 16,000 feet, Gaylor's fighters would descend from the blinding glare of the sun, obliterating the enemy formation before they could even reach their designated bomb release points. Word of the Navy's resounding success reached Army Air Force P-38 squadrons operating in the Southwest Pacific, prompting them to experiment with similar tactical positioning. The outcomes were remarkably consistent across diverse aircraft types and varied operational theaters. The synergistic combination of altitude and solar positioning invariably resulted in an invisible approach, leading to catastrophic surprise for the unsuspecting enemy. Japanese intelligence officers, recognizing the dire implications, endeavored to meticulously analyze this profound tactical shift. Captured documents dating from late 1944 unequivocally reveal their clear understanding of the unfolding situation. One particularly revealing tactical assessment, translated after the war's conclusion, starkly stated, American fighters consistently attack from high altitude with the sun behind them. Our pilots report inability to detect threats until attacks are underway. Recommend increased vigilance in sun quadrant and higher patrol altitudes. This demonstrated a clear comprehension of the problem, yet offered little in the way of a practical solution. However, a mere intellectual grasp of the problem regrettably failed to furnish a viable counter-solution. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to patrol effectively at the requisite 27,000 feet, as their aircraft simply lacked the performance capabilities at such extreme altitudes. Furthermore, the inherent limitations of human physiology meant they could not effectively discern threats within the sun quadrant, irrespective of their heightened vigilance. Thus, the recommendations, while tactically sound in theory, proved practically impossible to implement, given their existing technological and biological constraints. By October 1944, the doctrinal chasm that had opened between the warring air forces had become utterly insurmountable. American fighters held an undisputed dominion over the skies, commanding both the crucial altitude advantage and the blinding power of the sun. Consequently, they dictated the initiative in every single engagement. It was not a matter of Japanese pilots being unintelligent or lacking courage. By late 1944, their seasoned veteran pilots possessed a grim, first-hand understanding of precisely what was systematically decimating their ranks. Captured tactical directives from November 1944 vividly illustrate the desperate attempts by Japanese air commanders to devise systematic counter-tactics to the intractable altitude-sun dilemma. Their initial approach centered on modifying established formation structures. Instead of adhering to the standard 3-aircraft Shotai formations, Japanese squadrons began experimenting with widely spread-out defensive arrays, wherein individual aircraft maintained a vertical separation of 2,000 feet from one another. The theoretical underpinning of this revised formation was sound. If American fighters were to launch their attacks from an altitude of 25,000 feet, having one's own aircraft staggered between 14,000, 16,000 and 18,000 feet, should, in principle, provide mutual warning and support. The aircraft positioned at the highest point might potentially spot the diving attackers in sufficient time to alert the lower elements of the formation. However, in practical application, this expansive spacing catastrophically undermined formation cohesion, rendering the entire group acutely vulnerable to piecemeal destruction by the aggressive American fighters. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, revered as one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds and notably a key planner for the Pearl Harbor strike, proposed a radically different solution in December 1944. His innovative concept involved the deployment of sacrifice aircraft, dedicated spotters flying approximately 3,000 feet above the main formation. Their singular, perilous mission was to continuously scan the sun quadrant through heavily tinted goggles. These spotters were explicitly forbidden from engaging in combat or executing evasive maneuvers. Their sole purpose was to vigilantly observe the killing zone and transmit radio warnings upon detecting attacking Hellcats. Several squadrons courageously attempted to implement Genda's spotter concept during operations over Luzon in January 1945. The results, while marginally better than previous engagements, could still only be characterized as catastrophic rather than apocalyptic. On occasion, the spotters did manage to detect diving Hellcats sufficiently early to provide a fleeting warning of perhaps 3 or 4 seconds. However, a mere 3 seconds proved woefully insufficient. By the time the spotter transmitted the warning via radio, the information was processed, and the main formation could initiate a reactive maneuver. The Hellcats were already actively firing their weapons. Worse still, the spotters themselves quickly became priority targets. American pilots, demonstrating remarkable adaptability, swiftly learned to identify these isolated high-flying aircraft and eliminate them first, thereby neutralizing the crucial early warning system entirely. In the face of these systemic failures, some exceptionally experienced Japanese aces sought individual solutions. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, already a legendary figure for surviving combat wounds that would have proved fatal to most pilots, meticulously developed a unique tactical scanning pattern that partially mitigated the debilitating problem of solar glare. He consciously avoided looking directly into the sun. Instead, he systematically scanned the peripheral space around it in specific quadrants, utilizing his peripheral vision to detect any subtle movement. This technique leveraged the rod cells in the human eye, which are responsible for peripheral vision and possess a slightly superior function in conditions of high glare compared to the cone cells used for direct vision. Sakai's ingenious method undeniably worked for him, with his remarkable survival through 1944 and into 1945 serving as irrefutable proof of its effectiveness. However, its successful application demanded an extraordinary degree of discipline, years of accumulated combat experience, and an exceptional level of situational awareness. Crucially, it was a skill that could not be effectively taught to the average pilots within the severely compressed training timelines Japan faced in 1945. Most replacement pilots arriving at operational squadrons possessed a mere 100 hours of total flight time. They could barely maintain formation, let alone execute Sakai's sophisticated visual techniques while simultaneously managing their aircraft and maintaining comprehensive combat awareness. The Japanese also experimented with imposing time-of-day restrictions on their missions. The logic was straightforward. If the sun was the primary antagonist, then missions should be avoided when its position overtly favored American attackers. Consequently, several air groups implemented policies restricting missions to either the early morning or late afternoon, periods when the sun was lower on the horizon. This strategy, however, inadvertently created a new set of operational challenges. Early morning missions necessitated aircraft launching before optimal weather reconnaissance could be conducted, introducing an element of uncertainty. Late afternoon missions, conversely, severely compressed the operational window, leaving virtually no margin for unforeseen delays. And with typical American ingenuity, their fighter directors adapted instantaneously. They simply repositioned their combat air patrol ICAP stations to ensure the sun remained behind them, irrespective of the time of day. If a Japanese attack commenced at 0630 hours with the sun ascending in the east, American fighters would strategically position themselves to the east at altitude. Similarly, if an attack occurred at 1730 hours with the sun descending in the west, they would reposition to the west. The sun's absolute position changed, but the critical relative geometry remained constant. The Americans steadfastly maintained their decisive advantage. The relentless pressure exerted by American air power remained unyielding. As December 1944 arrived, the Imperial Japanese Navy adopted its most desperate and audacious counter-tactic: aggressive low-altitude attacks. Recognizing the futility of engaging at medium and high altitudes, where American fighters held a decisive advantage, Japanese strike groups began their approach to targets at remarkably low levels, often 500 feet or even lower. Their hope was to circumvent radar detection and prevent American fighters from gaining the crucial altitude advantage necessary for a devastating bounce attack. While this low-level strategy occasionally yielded sporadic successes against isolated targets, it proved utterly catastrophic when pitted against the formidable defensive screens surrounding American carrier task forces. Operating at an altitude of just 500 feet rendered Japanese aircraft visually detectable by vigilant destroyers and picket ships as far as 15 miles away. These forward-deployed vessels would promptly radio the precise position, heading, and composition of the approaching enemy formations, effectively negating any element of surprise. Consequently, American Hellcat pilots were no longer tethered to constant, high combat air patrols. Instead, they would simply ascend to an advantageous altitude of 15,000 feet, directly above the anticipated flight path of the Japanese attackers. There, they would patiently await the unsuspecting enemy to fly beneath them, before executing a swift, devastating dive onto aircraft that offered no viable escape route, apart from plummeting into the vast expanse of the sea. Moreover, these low-altitude incursions inadvertently eliminated the Japanese aircraft's inherent range advantage, as flying close to sea level guzzled aviation fuel at an alarming and unsustainable pace. Zeros and Kates, which could typically reach targets 300 miles away when operating at optimal altitude, found their operational radius drastically curtailed to a mere 180 miles at sea level. We invite you to stay with us and watch the remainder of this compelling video. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Please share in the comments where you are from and what your thoughts are on this fascinating topic. By February 1945, every one of these Japanese counter-tactics had demonstrably failed. Faced with such overwhelming aerial dominance, Japanese air groups were compelled to employ suicidal kamikaze assaults, not primarily for deeply ingrained ideological reasons, but because conventional tactical attacks had become utterly unfeasible. If an air crew could not survive long enough to even line up a proper bombing run, the deliberate crashing of their aircraft into the target became the only conceivable method to ensure that their mission inflicted any damage whatsoever. This grim shift represented a stark admission of their complete inability to contest the skies through traditional means. The altitude sun doctrine did not merely establish American air superiority. It fundamentally eradicated Japan's capacity to challenge aerial dominance using conventional fighter tactics. The conclusive statistics paint a vivid picture that transcends the individual skill or inherent courage of any single pilot. From June 1944 through August 1945, Hellcat pilots recorded a staggering overall kill ratio of 19:1 against all types of Japanese aircraft, meaning 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed for every Hellcat lost. This comprehensive figure accounts for every conceivable engagement, the flawlessly executed bounces from the sun, the chaotic low-altitude scrambles, unforeseen operational accidents, and losses sustained from ground fire. However, when isolating only those engagements where Hellcats meticulously employed altitude sun positioning in strict adherence to doctrine, this astounding ratio escalated dramatically to 26:1. These impressive figures were not speculative estimations or inflated propaganda. They were meticulously assembled through the analysis of gun camera footage, detailed aircraft action reports, and confirmed wreckage counts, all rigorously cross-referenced against Japanese loss records meticulously recovered after the cessation of hostilities. Commander David McCampbell concluded the conflict as the Navy's ace of aces, credited with an astonishing 34 confirmed kills. Lieutenant Alex Vesu finished with 19, Patrick Fleming also with 19, and Cecil Harris with 24. This distinguished list extends to hundreds of pilots who attained the coveted designation of ace, achieving 5 or more kills, during the critical years of 1944 and 1945. Yet the truly extraordinary aspect was not solely that individual pilots achieved such high scores. What proved truly remarkable was the sheer number of average pilots who not only survived but triumphed by diligently applying the established doctrine. Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Baker from VF-27, for instance, was not considered a natural fighter pilot. His instructors at Pensacola assessed his proficiency as merely satisfactory in gunnery, and noted that he required significant improvement in combat maneuvering. Nevertheless, Baker diligently learned altitude sun positioning, adhered to the tenets of the doctrine with unwavering discipline, and concluded the war with 7 confirmed kills, with 0 losses reported from his division. This tactical methodology effectively transformed competent but unremarkable aviators into formidable combatants, primarily because it systematically removed most of the complex variables that typically differentiate exceptional pilots from their average counterparts. The doctrine's effectiveness manifested itself with even greater profundity in the realm of pilot survival rates, eclipsing even the impressive kill ratios. In 1943, prior to the widespread adoption of altitude sun positioning, the average carrier fighter pilot could expect to survive only 3.8 combat engagements before being either killed or seriously wounded. By late 1944, that critical number had soared to an impressive 14.2 engagements. American pilots were surviving longer, which inherently meant they were accumulating invaluable combat experience, thereby becoming progressively more dangerous to the enemy in a self-reinforcing virtuous circle. Japanese pilot survival, conversely, followed a starkly inverse trajectory. In 1943, an average Japanese fighter pilot survived 6.1 engagements. By late 1944, this figure plummeted to a mere 2.3. Japan was losing its experienced pilots at a rate far exceeding their capacity to train replacements, and these new inexperienced replacements were dying before they could even gain any meaningful combat experience. This profound tactical asymmetry created an inexorable descent into operational collapse for Japanese naval aviation. To grasp the full practical implications of this reality, consider the Battle of Lake Gulf in October 1944. Japan dispatched a formidable contingent of almost 200 carrier and land-based aircraft to attack American forces. American combat air patrols, operating at their advantageous altitudes, decimated 173 of these aggressors over just 2 days of intense fighting. The total American losses amounted to only 16 aircraft. Crucially, of those 16, a mere 7 were lost due to direct enemy action. The remaining 9 were attributed to operational incidents. 1 pilot ditched due to fuel exhaustion. 3 aircraft crashed during challenging carrier landings, and 5 suffered mechanical failures. The Japanese were not simply being defeated, they were being decimated with such overwhelming efficacy that more American aircraft were lost to accidents than to direct combat. This was the unequivocal hallmark of absolute aerial dominance, operational losses, superseded combat losses, because the enemy simply could not effectively fight back. The altitude sun doctrine, enduring influence, stretches far past the conclusion of World War II. Korean warfighter pilots utilized precisely the same tactical methodologies against formidable MiG-15s. During the Vietnam era, F-4 Phantom crews frequently employed the sun for crucial positioning advantage during their engagements with North Vietnamese MiGs. Modern fighter doctrine continues to underscore the critical importance of energy superiority and attacking from an adversary's blind spots. Although advancements in radar and missile technology have undeniably altered the specific implementations, the bedrock tenet retains its undeniable potency. Position yourself where enemy sensors cannot effectively detect you, then attack with overwhelming speed and surprise. Every air combat manual written since 1945 includes altitude energy management and solar positioning as core concepts. The ingenious tactics that Hellcat pilots developed through arduous trial and invaluable experience in 1944 became the cornerstone of aerial combat instruction for 3 subsequent generations of fighter pilots. There is an inherent asymmetry, almost an unjust quality, to how this tactical principle operates. Japanese pilots in 1944 and 1945 frequently exhibited valor bordering on fanatical devotion. They were unequivocally willing to sacrifice their lives for their missions, launching relentless assaults despite facing insurmountable numerical and technological disadvantages. Their courage was undeniable. However, courage does not defy the immutable laws of physics. Bravery does not empower human eyes to pierce through blinding solar glare at 20,000 feet. Sheer determination does not magically add 2,000 feet per minute to an aircraft's climb rate. The altitude sun doctrine shrewdly exploits unchanging tenets of physics and human physiology. It was not that Japanese pilots lacked effort or resolve. It was that they were fighting an enemy they literally could not perceive until it was tragically too late. The Hellcat pilots were not inherently superior humans. Rather, they were humans who had learned to harness the raw power of solar positioning and gravitational acceleration against opponents who possessed no viable counter to either. This represented a stark divergence between sheer tenacity and intelligent application of tactical principles. The Japanese chose the former. The Americans discovered the latter. The kill ratios reflected that distinction with mathematical precision, 19:1. The numbers do not lie, and they hold no regard for courage. They only account for altitude, the blinding power of sunlight, and the 400 medhavki one is carrying when plunging out of the glare.